leading people emotionally. Leading has always had very strong emotional elements, and now even more so. In the last 2 weeks, we've had many conversations with people in a wide range of organizations. And what's very clear is the amount of anxiety, the amount of uncertainty, and the emotional management that every individual is needing to do and every leader is needing to do. And so in the webinars that we're running, we're turning our minds to this aspect of leadership. It's always been a vital aspect. It's even more so now. And this builds on, let me just get these, on two webinars which we've run in the last couple of weeks. So one of them was simply about hitting the ground running, doing remote working. And the other one was the important bit of, well, what's different about leading through a crisis? And now that things are marginally more settled, and I make that as an assertion, and you may or may not agree with that, we're now looking a little bit at the timeline of leadership and how you can lead your teams with more sense of where they're at emotionally, and keep an eye on where you're at emotionally. And at the start, this involves really considering, well, how do people respond to threat? And this is an important backdrop to consider. So a really useful model, and I think Anita said you were interested in some of the models. Well, we've got a couple of crackers for you. But the first one is simply looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what's really unusual about this current situation is about how much of a threat there is to people's safety, the sense of their financial safety and security, but fundamentally their sense of physical safety and security and health. And when people are affected at these base layers of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then this is very unsettling, destabilizing, raises a lot of anxiety, and is likely to trigger behaviors which are not always helpful. They're often very self-focused, and they're often not that measured. Now, you may notice at the top end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you move towards the more of the social needs, which have to be met. And these have also been threatened. So when we look at social needs, there's another model that we have found very helpful. And this is David Rock's SCARF model. And this helps understand what motivates people in social settings. We are deeply tribal mammals. And where we are socially is a big part of our sense of survival and our sense of security. And these 5 settings very clearly set out areas which have all been threatened recently. And in particular, certainty, autonomy, and relatedness. Now, we go into these models in a lot of detail in some of the other workshops, but I just wanted to set the scene by explaining this rather than going into each of these headings one by one. But as I do mention them, I invite you to think, okay, which of those have been threatened in me? Because as leaders, you're managing this not just for your people, but you're managing it for yourselves. Now, when these are threatened, it tends to trigger fight or flight. And neither of these are very helpful. In both fight or flight, we are reacting. Our emotions tend to control us more than we control our emotions. We're less able to be measured, and if our people have been triggered into this, then their emotional state is likely to be more variable. So these 2 models are a very useful backdrop. And as I said, I invite you to think about what have the changes over the past 2 weeks, what have they affected particularly in you? What does this change mean for you? And is there any particular strand that you think has been very foreground for you? I think for myself at the very beginning, it was about certainty. And then possibly a big focus on physical health for me. Have a think about what these changes have meant for yourself and different team members. Okay. Now, I'm not, so any thoughts, just note them down for yourselves. And the reason for asking this is because everybody on this call will be processing change in very different ways. Change is not linear in itself, and the way we process it is emotional, it's physical. We process change in our bodies, we hold change in our muscles, as well as in our heads and in our hearts and in our guts. All of us have different personalities and different personal histories. Different aspects of this will ring different bells for us and trigger different alarms for us. So as leaders, we need to be ready to offer different responses to meet people where they are. If we only meet them where we want them to be, we miss them and we leave them behind. And we also need to acknowledge where we are ourselves so that we can authentically and effectively lead others. So we've got a model which Elizabeth Kübler-Ross developed in the very late 60s, which comes from the world of grieving. It comes from death, grieving, whether that's a gradual thing or more traumatic. It's also been used extensively in the world of change in organizations, because we and other people have found that this is a very useful way of exploring, predicting, and therefore planning for different phases of a change. So first of all, I just want to just describe the main elements before passing over to Gary. So clearly, the first step is to go down the change curve, which could be very steep, it could be a bit more gradual, but shock is the first stage. And sometimes called immobilization. And that again is an attempt to make sense initially. And personally, I think I've been in shock some of the time, but have come out of it quite a lot of the time in this setting. What then often happens is denial. And in a classic grieving situation, that can actually be an inability to take in that somebody has died. And almost the mind searching for reasons that it isn't true. In this setting, I think we see it when people are apparently reckless in terms of dealing with the safety requirements around COVID, or when people think that something's just going to go back to normal in a week or two's time. Donald Trump, again, provides ample evidence of an aspect here. So denial is certainly a part of the coping strategy, coping within grieving, but we're also seeing evidence of it here. Frustration and anger is often a big part of grieving around death and around change. In ordinary change situations, I didn't want it to change. So if I'm not leading the change, change is being done to me, then often anger is simply an emotion that says, I don't want it to be like this. Now, it can be a very intense emotion like that, or it can be a bit less intense. But it's a healthy emotion that is looking for something to be different. In terms of the current situation, I think we're going to see more of it as people hit financial problems, or if various services, including the health service, isn't able to do what we have grown up expecting it to do. Then when we're hit personally by that, then I think we're likely to see a bit more. Depression is actually an attempt by the organism to go inward, to go inside, to regenerate, to make sense of what's happening. And Gary will talk a bit more about what that looks like and why that's got it's an important step organizationally. It's an important step personally, because it becomes a foundation upon which I can then move forward. I can then experiment, I can try new things in the experimenting phase, and then with decision, that's really more of a reinforcement that some of what I've been experimenting is working. And personally, I feel like I've spent quite a lot of time in the last 2 weeks between shock, probably early denial about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and then I've been more in experiment and a bit of decision with a bit of depression at times when I've had very bad news about people who I know. Couple of things to really emphasize. One is the Kübler-Ross model is particularly useful when you take it beyond the linear. It's a great way of thinking that all of these emotions are on the cards, they're on the table, and they can pop up at different stages. Certainly not always in this neat order. The other bit is that people loop around at different times. And then finally, whilst this is aimed at individuals originally, we're looking at it in terms of teams, because every team will have a center of gravity. Teams, again, are very social and will pick up cues from each other and from their leaders. And I guess that's the bit that Gary's particularly going to be focusing on, which is how can the leader influence and work really well with the team's center of gravity. Gary, over to you.
Lovely stuff, thank you. So I guess to serve your need right at the beginning, Suzanne, what we wanted to do was give everyone some really practical insights as to how you can help your team to survive during this period that we're working in at the moment. And so inherently, we have determined that it will be necessary to build a psychological plan in order to actively and effectively support our staff. So hopefully that will move on and we can go into the first box, Will. Thank you very much. So in the first instance, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise whatsoever to anyone, but you go from your normal state to all of a sudden the situation of COVID being a real, live and present situation. And I think the first thing that we all need to do as human beings is to support. And so the first constituent element of any psychological plan is how can you support your staff? As you move through shock into denial, the next stage of our psychological plan is how do we make sure we are being absolutely clear with people? What information do they need? How am I going to get it out to them? How am I going to reinforce that information in a way that is consistent and memorable? As you can see, when it dips back into depression, you do need to go back into support. So once you are confident that someone is clear, you can move back into support and make sure that you are carrying them on that journey through the change curve. The next box is the box that we find ourselves in immediately after the first green shoots from that depression, that inward focus period of time. And that's around direction. So direction is a moment where you need to give people really clear instructions about how they can start living in the new world and following the instructions of either the organization or indeed the manager. And then finally, the last phase, which is starting to get you into that business as usual territory, which we hope will not be too far in the future for many of us. But you start to then involve people. So again, it's about how do you reintegrate your staff team? How do you get them into that space where they once were, where they feel involved in decision making and actively contributing to the success of your organization? So one of the things that we're wanting to do is to go through each of the stages in a little bit more detail so that you as a leader and a manager can be conscious of what you're looking out for, and then to present some of the ways in which you might then choose to deal with that. So if we go to the next one, which is first of all shock, beautifully described by William earlier, it really is the moment where your staff are in absolute rabbit in headlights. They might be non-responsive. They communicate very little. There's a numbness. you might even find that people put up temporary defenses, and that is entirely natural and normal. What they're doing is they're giving themselves a little bit of psychological space in order to process the information, which may have been significantly far from their perception of reality. You might also find that this desire for space means that they go AWOL for a period, that they just need an hour, maybe a day, to compose themselves, to think about what the implications of all of this are. But ultimately, feeling in a state of shock is something that we can all relate to in relation to this specific instance. I've also seen some people who have gone into shock by frenetically working, so I thought I would add that in there as well. So from the context of being a leader or a manager, the things that you will need to do at this point in time is being really clear with simple messaging, making sure that you are affording people the time and the space to process. And I know it is extremely tempting to want to kind of like help people and maybe mollycoddle them, but actually giving them just a little bit of space after having given them some clear and simple messaging is a great way just to afford them that moment to process the information. Offering comfort, and as I said right at the beginning, acknowledgement that this is normal, and you will see me say that throughout a lot of this presentation. The model is a consistent model that has stood the test of time for nearly 60 years, and it is because it applies in many, many situations of change. I think in this context, and as William described earlier, there are going to be potential waves of shock in relation to this. There might be shock in relation to something that's happening at work in the first instance with everyone working at home. Then there might be a shock of someone else at home won't be earning the same amount that they once were. Then there might be the shock of someone else in another team who's been furloughed. So we have to remember that this is a really complex situation with lots of moving pieces. And as such, we need to constantly listen and adapt our strategy in accordance with some of these suggestions, and indeed others that you will come up with yourself, which are relevant to your organization. So the next stage, denial. What we're looking out for in this stage is our teams are giving you statements of disbelief. They're looking for evidence that it isn't true. They might be focusing on the past, or indeed behaving as if it were the past. And the extent to which they continue to do that may then start to mean that they lose touch with reality. So when I'm thinking about the people that I'm coaching at the moment, one of the things that I'm noticing manifest is that they're not following the instructions, either from managers or indeed from government themselves. They might think that it doesn't apply to them, or they might not think it's relevant. And that's a form of denial, a form of not acknowledging the reality that we are in. You might also find that you've given really clear instructions. We need this to change now. And I can think of one example where a manager was asking reception staff to kind of separate the chairs, and actually it just wasn't happening. And one of the reasons it wasn't happening is because those staff involved potentially were experiencing denial, and they didn't feel that it was going to be relevant. So what is it that you can do at this moment in time? Again, pure and simple, clear, simple messaging. Ideally, if you can write it down, that's even better, but making sure that you are giving it to all of your colleagues gradually and slowly in order to avoid overwhelm. The reason why writing it down is good is because then people can go back to it time and time again, just as they feel ready to absorb new information or indeed instructions. Help people to understand what's going on and answer any questions. In a period of either shock or denial, you get lots and lots of questions in that first instance, maybe as people are beginning to test their sense of reality. And being available to answer questions, or indeed take questions away that you might be able to answer later, is an important quality for being a leader or manager. As we've seen on social media, you will start to then see in amongst your teams misinformation, falsehoods, myths, that kind of stuff. Very often well-intentioned, but sometimes not helpful. And so this is your moment just to kind of keep your ear to the ground, listen to what people are saying to each other, and sensitively dispel those emergent myths in order to make sure people are aligning around those behaviors and needs and processes that your organization requires at this moment in time. And then be firm about those realities. It's really important when people are feeling vulnerable that they also feel safe and boundaried in as much as that is possible. So being firm with those information and realities, but also making a note of how people are responding to the information that has been shared. If there's a really strong reaction, just revisit that messaging, thinking about how you might be able to do it differently in order to land the key points more clearly. So the next phase is frustration. And frustration is the point at which you start to see an externalization of emotion to a much greater extent. So the kind of things that you're going to be looking out for are inherently some negative emotions. So that might be anger, resistance, obstruction, resentment, any of those kind of things. Now, we were talking about this earlier after the seminar this morning, and one of the things that I reflected on was that actually, as you climb the corporate ladder, very often your emotional regulation is something that's well rehearsed. And emotional regulation might not be something that is afforded to everybody. And you might therefore want to focus some additional attention to your first line managers. Those are the line managers in your organization who are managing frontline workers. And the reason being is because at this point, if you are more financially vulnerable, if your contract is more tenuous, if your situation at home is likely to be more complex, then the likelihood of being able to regulate your emotions at that point in time is going to be more challenging. And therefore, really doubling down, making sure that you're supporting your first line managers is going to be important. You might find during this period of time, either people abdicate responsibility for doing things or indeed work to rule. And again, that can be part of their kicking back against the system, that expression of anger and frustration. And in the worst situations, of course, you might find as you try and support people through or give them new instructions about how to manage change effectively, people could then be insubordinate. So what can we do as effective managers and leaders during this time? So first of all, I think listening is a really key quality. Not just making the time to listen, but to genuinely listen to what people are saying and how they're saying it. And again, as I said before, acknowledge that this is a perfectly natural response. It's very disarming when you're feeling angry to say, I understand, I hear what you're saying. This is perfectly normal and natural. Once you're confident that people understand the changes which are necessary, you can move to comfort and start talking about change as being an incredibly difficult thing, not least in this situation, which of course is highly complex change, but more broadly. So you're very much moving from that inform quadrant into that support quadrant. I think, as mentioned, we recognize that not everyone experiences change in exactly the same way, and being conscious of the center of gravity of your team at any point helps to inform which quadrant and which behaviors you need to implement as a leader. However, we will need to identify those disruptive influences and really redouble your effort on information and support to make sure that you can bring them on board. Very often, if you're leaving people behind, you will find that you'll have more disruptive influences, and therefore you'll need to revert yourself back to one of the earlier stages. And I think in this moment of massive change, massive flux, try to remind people about the things that won't be changing over this period. Now that might be, for example, as simple as your values as an organization, kind of really highlighting those as a key kind of compass for you to make decisions during this period of time will help people really invest in that sense of trust and a sense of those values being an important thing. Okay, so the next phase is the point at which the energy is the lowest, and that's what you're looking out for. You're looking out for those wide-ranging negative emotions of sadness, fear, and regret. And actually regret being a really important one there. That is people beginning to acknowledge that things are changing, that they are losing something, that the world is now different to how it once was. And so people very often at this point in time acknowledge that, go inside, and it's that process of going inside and having a think about what's going on and what that new reality might look like. And as you imagine, that's taking a lot of effort inside. And so what you might see on the outside is lower energy in terms of people's productivity. And you might even find that people are having more difficulty in managing a routine. And I think in one of our other webinars, particularly about remote working, this is one of the reasons why we said maintaining a routine was so incredibly important. Because if you develop that habit at the beginning of the lockdown and isolation, then it will stand you in good stead at this point in time, where maybe all of your agency is not where it might normally be. So as a manager, again, as a manager or leader, what are the appropriate things for you to do? So number one, no surprise, offering support and understanding. And again, helping people to understand that this is a natural point. Begin to introduce hope and medium-term plans. I think one of the ways in which people can feel like there's going to be a tomorrow is to starting to see what the world might be like in the not too distant future. When I was first composing these slides, I did think about saying medium and longer term plans, but I have to confess, most of the, I can see a few nods there. Most people are really uncertain about what that looks like. So, you know, just reach as far as you can in terms of thinking what might be coming around the corner, and let people know. It gives them that little draw to pull them into the next point. William, you were going to say?
Yeah, well, yeah, I just wanted to connect with the Leading Through Crisis webinar, which we did last week. And one of the things, as you've just alluded to, Garo, is the idea of stepping stones rather than suspension bridges. So on the one hand, we do need to keep the big picture. We do need to be looking further ahead, but we may need to be just taking one step at a time at the moment. So yeah, it's an interesting territory.
Yeah, it's tough. And certainly if you can't see what tomorrow has to offer, connecting people with the bigger picture. The bigger picture might be as simple as, Hetty, sorry, yeah, go on.
No, it's okay. I was looking for the thing which raises my hand, so I didn't do something that I really value in a lot of the Metsana work that I really love is this thing of getting practical. And one way to help people when they're really, really down is, you know, all the people I know are cleaning out their cupboards, you know, finally getting rid of all the junk. It's very, yeah, and Suzanne is nodding. I mean, that's very soothing. It's a very it's a very good way to reground for people. And you mentioned it in some of the others, but I think it's very relevant for this phase of depression. So I just wanted to add that in there, because finding ways to help people get practical that's also relevant for their work, you get a double win.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that resonates incredibly well with the last point of offering small, manageable projects with quick wins, and that sense of nesting and really kind of reconnecting with the things that give you comfort and security, very much so, Hetty. So connecting people with the bigger picture, that might be the bigger picture in terms of the organization. If you feel confident, it could be, we'll still be here tomorrow. Things will change, but we'll still be here. If you feel less confident about that, then it might be connecting people with a bigger picture around, we live in a country that has bounced back from difficult things in the past. We can get through this. Or indeed reminding the love that they have in their family home. So it can be a very simple bigger picture thing, but just connecting people with those buoyancy aids is important. I think one of the things before we move on is just to remind ourselves around where this originally came from, and it was around grief. And as we will know in the experience of grief in the real world, ritual is an incredibly important moment just to close things and get closure on things. Now, of course, with the passing of someone, that might be a funeral. But in this instance, it could be burning a process manual or banning tins outside as a collective in your organization in support of the NHS. Just some ritual that enables you to close the chapter on what was and look forward to what could be. Okay, next one. So the next phase, As we can see, of course, it's not linear, but now we are beginning to see the green shoots and the light of day. And this is starting to move firmly into the direction quadrant of your psychological plan. So what you're looking out for amongst your staff is they are beginning to adapt. They're asking constructive bargaining questions like, well, if this, then maybe I could do it this way, that kind of stuff. They're quite positive with their questions. It's how can I do this better? Or how could I do it differently, rather than I don't want to do it at all. You notice that your team is beginning to show much higher levels of alignment. Their sense of connectedness is absolutely increasing, and there's an increased sense of autonomy amongst all of those members of your team. And I think it's interesting that both connectedness and autonomy are very resonant with the SCARF model that we spoke about earlier. So as a manager, sadly, this is not the time for you to rest on your laurels. There is still much to be done. And therefore, what kind of appropriate action you might have is this is the moment when you can start to offer clear process and procedures to give people structure. You can start to introduce slightly more complex things at this point in time because people are emerging from what was a fog, and now they need instruction. They need to know how they can get back to normal, or whatever that new normal is. Now, of course, it might be the case that you've needed to make fundamental changes or significant changes to the way you do business. And therefore, rightly, capacity building your staff through training and guidance is going to be an important attribute to invest in. Allowing people to try different ways to address challenges whilst offering a clear direction of travel is a good way to increase that sense of autonomy again. And by that, I mean, don't give people absolute free rein. They're still a little bit bewildered as they've come into this new light space. But, you know, give them boundary, sense of direction, and allow them to kind of tweak and around the edges. This is a great chance as well to give people the opportunity to talk about the gremlins in the system. I certainly know from my responsibilities, having led thousands and thousands of staff in the past, that I think I've designed a process brilliantly, but in actual fact, once other humans get involved, it's not quite as good as I thought it was. And this is the time when you can invite your teams to feed back to you what's not quite working in the way that you had hoped. And of course, because people are still in the early stages, celebrate those small wins, really embed the positive learning by recognizing when people are getting it right. So we're getting into the latter stages now, and when people are in decision, you're very much now moving from the direction quadrant into the involve quadrant, and it will be for you to kind of work out when that feels right. But the kind of things that you're looking out for is people feel a lot more positive about where things are at this point in time. Your team members are showing very high levels of initiative, increased productivity, and a really comprehensive understanding of how the new world is and how it has changed. And I think I used the analogy of driving a car, that point in time where you're learning to drive a car and everything is extraordinarily conscious and there's not really very much headspace for anything else. But as you get better and better at it, it starts to become subconscious. And of course, what that does is it frees up a lot more of your brain, both for that initiative and indeed for increased creativity. So again, our job is still not done as leaders and managers. We still have things that we need to get done. And so at this point in time, good things to do might include offering options for things which still need to be finessed. So if you offer options for things earlier, people might not feel ready for that. They need a lot more direction and shaping at that point. But when they're in this phase, giving people options, you can do it either this way or this way. How might that look? How could you do it well? Is something that would work potentially better. Perhaps bring together small working groups to establish new practices on the foundation of the change program. So again, you might have changed things quite fundamentally, and therefore you might want to get small working groups together to come up with a new bolt-on, a new way of doing something in this new world. And of course, because productivities increase, because positivities increase, you can celebrate those more significant wins, which I hope everyone will be able to achieve. And then the final phase is integration. So in theory, this is the point where the work has been done. We've come out the other side and the change has been embedded. Our new way of working is very habituated amongst the staff and indeed ourselves. So the kind of things that we should be doing at this point as leaders and managers is, first and foremost, if Will can move it on, take stock of the learning. It's very easy to get distracted, move on to the next thing, but there is going to be, and has been already, so much learning from everything that's happened during this period. Perhaps as part of that learning, recognize which of your colleagues may need more support with changes in the future. There's one thing that's always constant, and that is that everything always changes. And knowing who in your team is comfortable with change and who in your team finds change more difficult is a great way to make sure that you manage collectively your team responsibly. Now, that might be just noting those people on either side of the camp and thinking about how you might buddy them up or get them to work together during a change program going forward. I think this is also the point in time, just to give yourself a pat on the back. This is incredibly hard. Of course, I hope, and you should be looking after yourself throughout this entire thing. But at the end of this experience, just take a little bit of time out to restore yourself, get back to normality yourself, and recognize that you've probably had for a number of weeks now a lot of adrenaline flooding through your body. So just kind of renormalizing, calming things down, doing something nice for yourself is important. And then, of course, start thinking about what next. This is going to be something that lives with us for an extended period of time and in different ways. And our interdependence is incredibly complex. Many organizations are going to have changed. And if we have organizations in our supply chain or indeed as collaborators, they'll be doing things differently as well. And so being cognizant of that, recognizing how you might need to adapt going forward will absolutely still be important. Okay, so I'm going to ask everyone to do a bit of typing now. So get your typing fingers ready, but I'm really interested to know, because we most likely will be doing this webinar again in the future for other people, is what from this are your key takeaways? In fact, there's fewer of us than there are this morning, so people could actually just say them out loud.
I think so. But if you're feeling a bit shy, by all means, tap it on the computer.
What about, Gary, those who find change very exciting? There are a few mavericks who, I guess it's a form of denial in a way, isn't it? That they're sort of saying, wow, this is great. Yeah, throw it all out, bring it on. And, and they're not necessarily the most helpful.
No, absolutely. And I think, and I probably didn't relate to it earlier, but the disruptive influencers can also be people who are really enthusiastic about change and are so far along the change curve, and they're trying to drag everyone along with them in a way that feels incredibly dissonant to where that person is at the moment in time. And so in addition to redoubling your efforts of support and information, you might also be inviting someone who has enthusiastically gone on to experiment and decision to say, you know, not everyone is where they are, where you are at this moment in time. What can you do differently to support your colleagues? And I think that's a really good point, Hetty. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and I think it's sometimes having that self-awareness and emotional intelligence to recognize what's going on around you. Where you are is very different to where others are around you, and how you can, adapt your behavior and attitude towards that.
And I think as leaders, very often, whilst in this situation, it might not be a significant amount of extra time that we know things in advance, but just knowing that we know things before other people sometimes is good to remind ourselves that we've maybe had a day to process this information already, and that other people should be afforded that level of processing time.
I thought that was all incredibly helpful. I think the reminders for me are, it goes back to sort of keep it simple, stupid, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So short, clear messages. You know, I did that earlier today, but in a sort of, because we were just about to do a remote billing process for the first time ever, and I can sense the nervousness amongst the secretaries and the associates and the partners and all that sort of stuff. So it's short and sweet and clear, with the least amount of ambiguity possible in the current circumstances, because that's not always going to be achievable. But I think, and also I think we as leaders have to be even more chameleon-like than we normally are, was the other thing, because all of those different bits on the change curve, acknowledging, supporting, different people are, you know, I've had one person today who's lost his mother at lunchtime to the virus. We've got someone in the HR team who's lost a mother and a father-in-law on consecutive days. So it's, you know, and the impact that has on the people around them in the teams and all of that sort of stuff as well. So
Cool.
you know, we are chameleons as leaders to start with, but I think even more so, and being, you know, as versatile as we can be.
Definitely. And I extend my sympathies to you and your team. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult time with many things that we wouldn't have expected to face. And I think improving our ability, our emotional intelligence, and our capability to have conversations, really high quality conversations, is so important in this time. I know that one of the next webinars that we'll be delivering is helping people to deal with anxiety, that sense of being afraid of what's around the corner. And I think those one-on-one conversations, those really practical conversations, are something that we can support people with as well, in giving some tools to do that.
Jonathan.
Yeah, again, Suzanne, sorry to hear that news. And you know, talking to clients in the last day or two, I think one of the things I'm picking up is that we're in a bit of a transition zone through this whole process that you've mapped out here. And I think for some companies in particular, they're starting to settle a little bit. The whole shift to remote working, it's almost like the worst of that is almost over for some of them. They're starting to settle, starting to just get a little bit of a rhythm up of some semblance of BAU. And I think for leaders, the important thing now is to sort of look ahead and ask, okay, the next week or two, maybe the next 3 weeks, I think it's going to be really tough, because if you look at the tracking of the virus and the numbers, it's only going to get worse in these next 2 or 3 weeks, with sadly more and more people dying, frankly. And so it's more and more likely that people in our teams, people in organisations, are going to be directly affected by that. So I think as leaders, we've got to kind of look ahead and be ready for that, and ready for that much bigger emotional impact on people, because that's just the reality we've got. And I think being ready for that from a practical point of view, in terms of some contingency planning, and how do we deal with, you know, have we got plans in place to keep the business running, but also on an emotional sense, in terms of, you know, it's going to get harder.
I think it's sort of like what's happening overnight is we're all having to become trauma specialists.
Exactly right.
You know, and I really want to underline what Gary just said about high quality conversations, because what a lot of people are doing, that I'm observing both with clients and friends and colleagues, is an absolute orgy of social media communication, you know, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook, whichever, and that's actually not doing it. And what people are hungry for and desperately need right now is the high quality conversation, the emotional intelligence that you were talking about, and, you know, just the space and time. And we're all, I think we have to acknowledge, we're all massively stretched. Working from, you know, 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night is actually the norm right now. And we're in a trauma situation. Collective trauma. You know, when you gave that news, Suzanne, you know, my heart just stops. It's really awful. For you as well, and for your team, and for obviously the person involved.
Thank you, Suzanne, Hetty.
So yeah, it just makes me stop, actually. It makes me stop, but I think that's the reality that we're all dealing with, and from time to time we come up against, and as Jonathan said, we also need to plan for, in as much as we're able to. So we welcome any other questions that you might have going forwards. Anita and Suzanne in particular want to thank you very much for attending, and Hetty as well. If you have further questions, please email us. The last thing is that if you would like a copy of the materials, we'll be sending those out and adding you to our mailing list just for periodic updates. Otherwise, we will be doing webinars from time to time, but let us know if we can support you in any way. This is what we do for a living.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
very useful. Stay
Thank you.
safe and well, everybody.
You too.
And you, Suzanne.
Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.